Okay, and this is the sixth part of a series I'm doing on science that the Bible gets right. And in this particular section, I'm going to talk about Adam and Eve. I've already talked about the others listed on the page there, as you can see, and I'll leave links in the description below for each one of those parts if you'd like to watch the previous ones. So yes, I'm making a claim that there's actually scientific evidence that Adam and Eve actually existed. All right. So, but what I want to do now, I'm going to provide evidence that Adam and Eve existed, but I'm more concerned at the beginning of talking about what our scientific method. In other words, what do we do first with our scientific method? Well, we've got to gather the facts first, then we reason to the past, not the other way around. But I would venture to guess that most atheist evolutionists, especially, they don't do it that way. They do it the opposite. They have their preconceived evolutionary ideas, and then they force all of the data to fit their preconceived ideas. So even in Christian circles too, there's a lot of differences on who Adam and Eve are. If you're a young Earth creationist, no problem. You take the Bible for what it says. If you're an old Earth creationist, then you have to do something with the story of Adam and Eve, make it not apocryphal, but mythical or something. But anyway, I don't want to get into that too much. But does the evidence support, the secular science evidence actually support the idea of an Adam and Eve? And my contention is yes, it does. So, but let me again caution us that trying to massage the data into your preconceived belief system, that's not science. It's not science. So, the first bit of evidence comes from a short secular science video clip talking about human genetics and Adam and Eve. So, let's watch the video.
You have the materials inside you right now to unlock the story of your deep, distant ancestry. And also mine. That's partly because you have mitochondria in your cells, and you got them only from your mother, not your father. And if on your 23rd pair of chromosomes you have an X and a Y, like I do, rather than an X and an X, then you got that Y chromosome only from your father. Together, these two facts mean that there's an unbroken line of mothers and mothers' mothers who passed down the DNA in their mitochondria for hundreds of millennia, creating a biological thread that connects you to a single female ancestor, regardless of your gender. And it also means that there's a lineage of fathers and fathers' fathers who passed on their Y chromosome uninterrupted, leading back to a single male ancestor. Okay, now I know what this might sound like. I'm not talking about the first two people. I'm talking about two humans who lived at different times in the distant past, about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. I'm talking about two people who never met, but who, because of this odd quirk of genetics, combined with some unique evolutionary circumstances, managed to pass on a very small fraction of their genomes to you, and to me, to all of us. And this is an incredibly powerful tool for studying where we all came from. We're only beginning to understand the legacy of these two people to whom we're all related. It's a legacy that goes back some 10,000 generations. And going back even further, it appears that all known haplogroups converge at a single female ancestor who lived roughly 200,000 years ago. So our mitochondrial ancestor can tell us a great deal about where we came from and when. But we also have to talk about what she can't tell us. She isn't the first woman of our species, or the first anatomically modern human, or anyone really special for that matter. For one thing, there's evidence of modern humans as far back as 300,000 years ago in northern Africa. So we know our species was around long before this woman lived, for thousands of generations. But their mtDNA just didn't make it to the present day. The fact that one woman passed on her mitochondrial genome to all of us is really just a matter of chance. Think of it this way. In any given generation, a woman might have sons but not daughters. And if she only has sons, that means none of her mitochondrial DNA will get passed on. So our mitochondrial ancestor is the only person who managed to have one or more female offspring, who in turn also had female offspring in an unbroken line for the past 200,000 years, by sheer chance. And when it comes to how far back this Y chromosome goes, the latest molecular clock calibrations now suggest that our Y chromosomal ancestor lived about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. Much like with our mitochondrial ancestor, this guy must have had at least one male offspring, who in turn had more males, in an unbroken line for hundreds of millennia. Now, we don't really understand why these two individuals left the indelible mark that they have in our genomes. But even when we do, each of us will continue to carry the molecular legacy of one man and one woman who managed to make their mark on all of humanity.
Okay, so in the video, the presenter, the atheist evolutionist presenter, makes the claim, and I'm glad he did. I've heard of mitochondrial Eve before. I've heard that story for quite a few years. And to hear about the Y chromosome Adam, well, that's awesome. And to say that Adam and Eve, that we're all related to the same ancestral pair of humans, well, you have to ask yourself, so where have I heard that story before? Anyway, of course, the atheist evolutionist, he's got an excuse. He's got a just so story. He's got a religious testimony, and I don't mean that. I don't mean religious testimony in a bad way. We have religious testimonies. I mean, he's gone from science to a faith-based religion, but at this point, he gives his testimony, his religious testimony of how that could quote quote possibly happen. But that is, he's left science and he's skipped over into religious faith and belief. So let me say this, Mr. Atheist. If you're willing to buy his story of how he says it happened, then you've just skipped over into religious faith and belief, which I have no problem with as a theist. But don't accuse me of something that's ridiculous when you do the same thing. When you come up with these just so, and some of the stories are so ridiculous, it's beyond the pale, and this one might even measure up to that. So what's his just so story? Well, his just so story is that Adam lived between 200 to 300,000 years ago, and Eve lived 200,000 years ago, which, of course, if you overlap the two, they could have met, but let's suppose they didn't for 100,000 years. Well, the story is they never met. They just had their offsprings, and he had all the males and she had all the way down until they met. So anyway, that's their story, and they're sticking to it. So question, kind of a tongue-in-cheek question, really. Anybody on the atheist side willing to call that hogwash yet? You willing to look at that story critically and call that hogwash yet? Okay. Well, even Richard Dawkins, he'll say that the human race has been here about 200,000 years, but sometimes in debates, just for the sake of argument, he reduces it down to 100,000 years. But let's say, like Richard Dawkins says, the human race has been around for 200,000 years. Okay, so now we're going to add some more evidence. And this evidence, what I'm trying to do is whittle that 200,000 years down smaller and smaller. So what we're going to start with is some more genetic information, just like the presenter. But we're going to talk about what we call genetic diversity. There are things called genetic diversity studies. So what is genetic diversity? Well, genetic diversity is the total number of genetic characterizations in the genetic makeup of species. It ranges widely from the number of species to differences within species, and can be attributed to the span of survival for a species. What does that mean? More simply put, is the longer a particular species has been on this planet having babies, every as the population grows, every particular individual of that population could represent, by chance, random mutations, natural selection and random mutation. The more populations you have, the more chances you have to mutate the DNA. That means changes in the DNA. So when you compare two people's DNA, as the population grows, and over time, the more population, the more chances, the DNA changes, and there's a percentage change in the DNA. Okay, so if a population's been around for 6 million years, you could have 25% difference in their DNA when you compared them, something like that. I'm not making a dogmatic rule, but that's the idea. So let's give a really good example, an actual example that exists today. And when you read this, you really ought to go, okay. All human beings are 99.9% identical in their genetic makeup. Differences in the remaining 0.1% hold important clues about the causes of diseases. 99.9%. I want you to get that into your head for all humans. 99.9%. And the differences are caused by the diseases that we've had. Well, think about that for a minute, because we're going to talk about it. So, okay, so far, the facts that we have, we can trace our ancestry back to the same ancestral pair of humans, mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Adam, and the genetic diversity of the human species is only off by 0.1%. Again, 0.1%. And that difference can be attributed to the diseases we've had. What's wrong with this picture from a purely evolutionary, atheistic perspective? Well, okay, now just think of this. So you have the actual secular scientists who discovered the fact that we're only 0.1% difference, and they have the next meeting of the materialist evolutionist only explanation club. And so the gentleman says, gentlemen, calm down. We just need to invent another just so story to explain away this actual scientific data sitting right in front of our collective faces. I mean, the actual factual evidence we have, yes, points to some strange things based on genetic diversity studies. I mean, it shows that the human race is, well, it's only one species today. And since there's only 0.1, I said 0.1% difference between all humans and the human race is, it's unfortunately for us, it's a very young species. So gentlemen, to keep our evolutionary belief system, we need to trash the actual facts we have, and we need a just so story to explain it. And so what's going to be our savior? What story can we come up with to save our precious evolutionary paradigm? Well, we can propose a bottleneck event that had to be told to preserve evolution. Hello? Well, excuse me. What's a bottleneck event? Well, okay. Here's an example. The controversial Toba catastrophe theory. Now, let me say this. This is not the first time I've heard of the Toba catastrophe theory. Do you know that the Toba catastrophe theory was also used by another scientist who swore up and down that it was what was responsible for the death of all dinosaurs, not 65 million years ago, and the asteroid hitting the planet. Yeah, they swore up and down that that's what it was. So apparently they're going to repurpose it, and they're going to take that, and they're going to now say, no, the Toba catastrophe only happened 75,000 years ago. Not 65 million years ago to kill the dinosaurs, but 75,000 years ago to wipe out the human population down to 10,000 to 30,000 individuals. That's what they're saying. Well, that's a bottleneck. That's a population bottleneck event. Well, so that would make the human species at least 75,000 years old, but there's a problem. There's supposedly more than one bottleneck event in our past. And the latest one is interesting. Listen to this one. This is a quote again from another secular science study. Around 7,000 years ago, all the way back in the Neolithic, something really peculiar happened to the human genetic diversity. So from 7,000, it says over the next 2,000 years. So that means from 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, and seen across Africa, Europe, and Asia, the genetic diversity of the Y chromosome collapsed. Okay, and then they say by computer model, they know what happened. So, of course, just like the guy in the video, they're going to give you their evolutionary, just so evolutionary story, how it was possible. Ooh, and they did it by computer model even, how this could happen. So what does that mean about the human race? Well, that means that the human race is between 7,000 and 5,000 years old. 7,000 and 5,000 years old. Well, where have I heard this story before? Where have I heard? That's interesting. And since bottleneck events are quite rare, we have to pick the bottleneck event that fits the data the best. So based on our genetic diversity of only 0.1%, the human DNA is only 0.1% different between humans. That means we're going to have to pick the 5,000 to 7,000 year old bottleneck event. Of course, before we do that, we've got to come up with a quote unquote just so story to explain it first, so we don't trash our evolutionary theory. So again, where have I heard that man is no older than 7,000 to 5,000 years old? That would be the Bible. Again, isn't that interesting? So it seems from where I sit, that the genetic fact that we just added could mean that God had a special creation of man anywhere from 7 to 6,000 years ago. Yeah, and or the flood of Noah 6 to 5,000 years ago would explain it as well, because that would the flood would wipe out the genetic. As a Christian theist, I don't have to invoke a just so story to explain away the data. I don't have to come up with a reason. I can just say it fits the biblical record to a T, and it does. So, is there any other evidence that we can bring into this Adam and Eve story? Well, of course there is. So, let's watch this secular history video clip.
Right around the year 5000 BC, just at the time that Sumerian culture as we know it burst onto the historical stage. So this is a theory that I think deserves some consideration. That as the waves of Semitic-speaking farmers moved down the rivers from the mountains to the north, they met another population coming up from the south, a ravaged and devastated people, speaking a language that had evolved independently, and telling tales of a flood that had drowned the whole world. The clue to this theory comes, once again, from mythology. The Sumerian version of history was dominated by a devastating event of apocalyptic proportions. And if you were brought up reading Bible stories, you may find it familiar. The Sumerians believed that in a time long before, in the time of their most distant ancestors, a great flood had washed over the world. This same story would later pass on into the legends of the Babylonian Empire, and from there to the Hebrew poets who wrote the first books of the Bible. For this reason, the story of the flood is perhaps the oldest continuously told story, and it's in this legend that the clue to the origin of the Sumerians might lie. The story of the flood is so striking that many historians with varying degrees of credibility have tried to come up with some historical event that may have inspired it. Another legend, called the myth of Enki and Ninursag, relates a creation story in which the god Enki creates man in a land called Dilmun. Like the Garden of Eden, Dilmun is an earthly paradise.
In Dilmun the crow does not utter its cry, the lion does not kill, the wolf does not seize the lamb, the wild dog, devourer of kids, is unknown.
Dilmun is thought to have been what is now Bahrain, an island in the middle of the Persian Gulf, that body of water that was once a fertile river valley. All we have on this subject is speculation, and until any further evidence is found, this will remain just a theory.
Okay, so in the clip, both the Adam and Eve and the flood of Noah are spoken about by the vast majority of nations living 5,000 years BC. You've got the Sumerians, Babylonians, Egyptians, and later on we'll see of course, the Hebrews, of course, the Bible, the Greeks. I mean, they're all named. Interesting that they would have these stories. In fact, the presenter in the video says that the story of the flood of Noah is perhaps the oldest continuously told story. And he says by the vast majority of nations living 5,000 years BC, and we're here 2,000 years BC about, and that's about 7,000 years. That's right in line with what the scripture says. Interesting. Another quote. The Hebrew and Greek accounts are not alone in the literature of the Near East. Mesopotamian civilization and culture are considered to have begun at Sumer, just like the video says. And the Sumerians had a paradise myth That would be Adam and Eve, composed in the 2nd and 3rd millennium BC. It consists of an unmistakable parallel with the biblical account. Likewise, in ancient Egypt, the theme of an original paradise was pervasive. Quote, the oldest known written language is Sumerian, and it dates back to at least 3500 BC. The earliest proof that the written Sumerian language existed was the Kish tablet. While the Kish tablet doesn't, it just shows how old the language is. The Sumerians, again, the Sumerians had a creation story and a flood story on other clay tablets. In fact, here's a quote from Wikipedia about that. Okay, and you can stop it and read that if you want. But it talks about the flood and the person they warned to build an ark. That's the flood story. So what are the actual tangible secular facts that we have? What are they? Just the facts, please. Well, all humans share the same ancestral pair of humans. All humans only differ in 0.1% of their genetic makeup, making them one species and a very young species. By the way, do you happen to know what Mr. Charlie Darwin actually named his book? Well, he named it this, if you don't know, and most people don't. All we talk about is On the Origin of Species. But it says, on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means Charlie Darwin, I'm going to try to say, is a racist. He believed, like the Nazis believed, in the Übermensch, the Superman, that they were better than everybody else. In other words, they were unfavored races. There were unfavored races. That's interesting, isn't it? And the Nazis took him for his word, and they tried to exterminate all the races that they said were inferior to theirs. But today, scientifically, guess what? We know that all humans are only 0.1%. Now, don't forget this. We're only 0.1% different in our genetic makeup today. So, what do we have? The vast majority of all ancient cultures recorded both the Adam and Eve story and the flood story. So now, the only real question left is how to interpret the actual data. That's the actual data that we have. And again, you have to take the facts that we have and you have to find out what the facts are and then interpret them into the past, not the other way around. Well, the materialist atheist doesn't do that. He trashes all of the actual factual data, the science, and the recorded history, and say they don't matter. They never bring up the recorded history, and if they do, they just toss it away like it doesn't even exist. And then they propose a bottleneck event to explain away the data. Well, as a Christian theist, I don't do that. It fits the biblical story. In fact, you know what? Here's a really funny thing. The atheist needs a bottleneck event, but the only bottleneck event they won't believe in, the only bottleneck he won't accept, is the only one actually recorded in history. Isn't that interesting by ancient cultures, the flood? In fact, I told you, the bottleneck event that they propose, they accept. And it happened exactly around the time of the flood, according to their records. But we can't go there. We call that being a hypocrite in Christian circles. So, when an atheist evolution needs a 75,000-year-old catastrophic event like Mount Toba, no problem. Catastrophe good. In fact, they do it all the time. Whenever they need a catastrophe, they pull it out of the hat. That's what they do. They pull a catastrophe out of the hat whenever they need one. But if God brings a worldwide flood, evolutionists say catastrophe theory bad. But it actually fits the data. Now, the catastrophe theory of 75,000 years ago doesn't fit the data, but the one in the Bible actually fits the data. So, since I took it this far, I'm going to go a little bit farther with it. I didn't mean to, but we're going to talk a little bit about some scientific evidence for a worldwide flood. And of course, is there any scientific evidence for a worldwide flood? Well, of course there is. And this came from an atheist who I was debating. They put this up on the screen. Most mountains have marine fossils embedded on the rocks on top, near the top or so. Really? What dishonest creationists, that would be me, like you, skip very conveniently, is that these fossils are more than 50 plus million years old. 50 plus million years. Also, these mountains were below sea level. Mountains grow due to continental drift and tectonic actions. Mount Everest grows about 1.5 inches per year. That was her quote to me. And okay, so I'm not going to get into the the 50 million years, all that stuff right now. I don't have time for that, but I will deal with it in another video. But most mountains have marine fossils embedded in the rocks on the top. Okay, how could most mountain ranges get fossils embedded on the rocks on the top? Okay, now watch this. This is another short video clip we're going to watch about the Grand Canyon.
Geologists learn to visualize the way that this place looked in the past. Knowing how to read the texture of the rock, the kind of rock it is, the fossils that are in it, geologists can, it's like a detective story. You can uncover what this place looked like billions of years ago.
This is now desert country, more than 300 miles inland. And yet, these shells, encased in solid rocks, are ocean fossils.
In this one cliff, you can find fossil shells that look like you'd pick up on the seashore today. They die, they fall to the bottom of the seafloor, and they get trapped and die in the mud at the bottom of the ocean at the time that they're being deposited.
Shells like these come from shallow tropical waters, an inland sea that first arrived here 500 million years ago and covered the flat, low-lying plain. Ancient fossils of sea animals tell geologists that this land was once under the waves of an inland ocean. But that leads to yet another mystery. The investigation needs to figure out why these undersea rocks are now high in the air, thousands of feet above sea level.
It's surprising to go up a mile above sea level and you find a clamshell or what looks like a clamshell. And you say, that's what I see when I go down to the ocean. So why is it here a mile above sea level?
So in the video, the presenter exclaims that something is very unusual. Now, the Grand Canyon is over 300 miles away from any ocean. And yet, at the bottom of the canyon, all the way to the top of a canyon, what does he find? Marine fossils. You should be going, So, could a worldwide flood explain why the mountain ranges the world over have sea fossils at the top? Even Mount Everest? Or why there's sea fossils from the bottom of the Grand Canyon and a mile high sea fossils? Yeah, it could. So we have actual genetic data to support the idea of Adam and Eve. We also have genetic data to support the idea that the human race is 5,000 to 7,000 years old. Again, those are time periods given by secular scientists, not creationists, and you can go read it yourself. So all of this, of course, fits the biblical data, but we also have physical prima facie evidence of a flood with sea fossils at the top and all the way down to the bottom. And we have written records from several ancient cultures mentioning both. So, conclusion. I'm telling you, folks, there has never been a better time in human history to be a believer in Jesus and to love the study of science. Because I'm telling you, with all the studies I've done, and one of the most fascinating is DNA, information. Where does information come from? The first cell had to have 400 million lines of code. The very first cell had to have 400 million lines of code in order to replicate itself. Where did all that come from? Where did all that specified complexity come from? Where did the million micromachines needed to regulate the cell, the million micromachines needed to regulate its cells, where did it all come from? And we have scientific evidence that Adam and Eve are real two people. We are really related to two people. And the scientific evidence says that the human race is only 5,000 to 7,000 years old. Their excuse is a population bottleneck, but that is their excuse and just so story that they have to postulate. They have to believe that if they want their evolutionary theory to be true. I don't. I can take God's word at its word. I can believe what it says from the very first page. So, in my opinion, God has communicated with his kids, and he's put it in his word. Awesome for me. Thanks. Bye.